We're about to set the stage because up next is all about responsible gaming, building a safe, trusted, and accountable gaming environment for digital Nagriks. Once again, the session will be spearheaded by Vivan, Sharan, partner Koan Advisory Group. And we also have our industry leaders joining us in the next few minutes. We're about to get the session started. Meanwhile, also keep those thoughts coming using the hashtag IGC. I've already told you what's up for grabs. In fact, after the session, we'll have the signed footballs, these footballs being signed by none other than Baichung Bhutia, and the gloves that have been signed by Mary Com. These are up for grabs. So I'm going to request you to keep your thoughts flowing in, be it across Instagram, across Twitter, X, or for that matter, LinkedIn. But do share so that then we can also gather your thoughts and then hand over these wonderful gifts as well to our members of the audience, for the ones who participate with your thoughts mainly. Looks like we're set. But let's actually get the session started, and let me please invite Vivan, Sharan to please come on stage. We'll have Vivan to spearhead the session, and together we'll welcome your panelists as well. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon we have with us none other than Rakesh Maheshwari, former Chief Coordinator, CyberLaws Division. Okay, I've been informed that he's joining us in a short while. But we have with us Nagmanjunath, Shivakumar, Country Head Bureau. We also have with us Vandith Pamuru, Assistant Professor, ISB, and Sarah Ramanauskas, Co-Founder and Chief Executive Officer, the Game Safety Institute, who's actually joining us virtually. So again, it's a very interesting mix. Well, we'll again harness the power of technology to keep the conversations going. So with that, Vivan, again, I'm going to quickly hand it over to you.
Hi. Sarah, hello. Thank you for joining us from distant shores. And as we discussed, we'll kick it off with you. And I don't think there's much need of introduction of responsible gaming at this point. We've had 1.5 days of discussion on the general construct around responsible gaming, the various values associated with it, openness, trust, accountability, all of these words and terms. But Sarah, you are in the business of converting these terms into actionable tools. And can you tell us a little bit about how you do that? What are the specific tools, Sarah, that the Responsible Gaming Institute promotes, evangelizes, builds, co-builds? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and apologies to everybody in the room. I can't see you. I would love to be there. I would love to be there with you. All I can see is my little face on a big black screen. So apologies for that. I do hope you can hear me okay, and I'm coming across okay. And thank you for that invitation to tell the audience about the tools that we develop at the Game Safety Institute. We actually don't really develop any tools at the moment. What we do is we advise operators and regulators and governments around the world. And I thought, to make the session useful, maybe I could kick off with some examples of what's working well and especially not so well around the world. And I'd actually like to pick up on a couple of things that I heard from the session just now as I was preparing to come in, and maybe give you some thoughts and some inspiration for that. So I think for responsible gaming, what's working well, what's not working so well. I think there are a couple of areas where I see things that are working well. So here in the UK, for example, hello from London, here in the UK, our Gambling Commission does enforcement really well. So, when you're thinking about player protection in India and the player protection ecosystem, it's all very well having regulations, but you need to enforce those regulations. How are you going to do that? And I think there's quite a lot of learnings that you can potentially take from the UK. There's also some interesting work, I think, coming out of Brazil, and some regulation work that we're seeing in Brazil, which is all about transparency. I know we just talked about transparency. But those particular gaming regs in Brazil ensure that the player, when they're using a game, actually understand what's going on and understand how the game plays. So I think, again, coming back to what you just heard in the previous session, when you're thinking about developing a game, when you're thinking about consumer engagement, think about transparency and how do you make that gameplay really transparent and understandable to the user. So that's a really important part of player protection. So I think if I may just briefly talk about where it's not going so well, and that's in the United States, which, like India, has a state level of regulation, but then currently no federal regulation of gambling. So responsible gambling or responsible gaming is all at the state level, and it's all with the operators. And the American Gaming Association has proudly come out and said recently that they spent $107 million on consumer-facing RG education. So they're very proud of the fact that they're spending all this money on RG education. And what I'd like to say to you folks in the room in Delhi is they're actually not really doing that at all well. And the opportunity, I think, for India and the Indian gaming organizations, companies, regulators, is to do things differently. So I and a number of people across the states and in various different aspects of safer gaming are now saying, let's dissociate responsible gaming from problem gambling. Because what you see at the moment with responsible gaming messaging, which is what we use to try and get people to use these tools, is that there's a conflation of play responsibly and dial 1-800-GAMBLER. And what that means is that the stigma associated with gambling addiction is kind of transferred onto the play responsibly messages. So there are a number of initiatives happening to try and move away from play responsibly, because we know that's just not working. There's a great article recently by Professor Alan Feldman that I recommend you Google. So Professor Alan Feldman for Problem Gambling Education Month. Google that and see what he has to say. I really agree with him that what we need to do is to talk much more about how to play in a sustainable way. So not have kind of responsible gaming as a completely separate page somewhere on your website or somewhere in the app, but just like build that into the game experience, make it part of the game experience, just make things like deposit limits and time limits something that your skilled game players, your skilled gamers just do as part of the game experience. So I think to sum up, I don't think there is really such a thing as responsible gaming. There shouldn't need to be such a thing as responsible gaming if we take the idea and translate that into a safer and more entertaining experience for players, rather than just trying to message it as something separate, because that's just not working.
Thank you. We'll come back to that provocative thought that there is no such thing as responsible gaming. First, can I go over to Manju to pick up on some of these threads? You know, a lot of the tools that she talked about, aside from messaging, the various prompts, let's say, for users, for instance, these all introduce new frictions into the player experience. So how do you reconcile that with the incentives for both users and businesses to build these into their platforms? And as you see it from your vantage point, where you're working on identification of good and bad behaviors on these apps.
Sure. The onus of identifying the bad users, I mean, it falls on the gaming companies. But what they typically nowadays rely on is your traditional methods like KYC. Unfortunately, KYC is not enough, because we've seen this, I mean, in different industries as well, saying that there's fraudsters innovate really well, and especially tampering KYC is something that comes very easily to them. So what we do is we look at the behavior of, like, I mean, bad gamers. And typically what you realize is that bad gamers have a pattern, right? They're typically habitual offenders. Now, if you're looking at habitual offenders, they also leave like a trail. There is a pattern. And that's when we actually look at new age identifiers without actually introducing friction into the system. It could be as simple as your email ID, your phone number, and your name. It also leaves, like, I mean, this has got a ton of information that we can actually gather, triangulate information from various systems to be able to identify if this particular person is a bad gamer. So you're going beyond just your regular KYC. Also, I mean, obviously, like in terms of understanding the behavior, we use AI. I mean, it's an abuse term, but honestly, this is where AI would actually be used in a good context and effectively to be able to differentiate between a good gamer and a bad gamer.
So can you unpack that a little bit? How does it look in your dashboard when you're looking at these things popping up, good gamer, bad gamer? How do you do it?
Let me give
Some
you
mechanics.
Yeah, most certainly. Like, I mean, if you look at the incidence of, like, I mean, fraud from bad gamers, there are different ways you need to look at this, right? So, as I mentioned, we're not necessarily just collecting information from documents, but we also look at device information as well. Also, your digital footprint at a macro level, like, I mean, what is Vivan like, your digital and social footprint? We zero in on all of this. So let me actually give you real-life examples of how it looks like.
Please.
Yeah. Some of the things that the gaming industry is used to is spoofing, collusion. All of this is actually what they used to. So now, when we look at like a device, so it's easy for fraudsters to be able to manipulate all of this with respect to IP, use proxies, use spoofing to be able to give an identity which is not exactly their own, or they're presenting an identity which isn't actually their own. So using AI, we're able to identify if that particular person is who he claims to be. Another thing which is relevant in whatever conversations I've heard over the last day is age gating. A lot of minors actually end up playing on accounts which is not on accounts which are not supposed to be. So here, using AI, we also figure out what is the kind of a behavior that an adult actually showcases versus what a minor.
Again, this is very intriguing. Can you give an example before we move on from you? What does an adult do that a minor doesn't and vice versa?
No, for example, like, I mean, in terms of your keystrokes, the kind of pressure that you do, in terms of, like, I mean, the shortcuts. So just giving you a very, very rudimentary kind of an example in terms of, like, what a kid with respect to a game can actually do with, in terms of surpassing the number of levels, could be 5 or 6 times faster than what an adult plays. It's, again, very, very specific.
That I can believe. And when you look at how young users are using social media with one finger, and it's just unbelievable level of dexterity. But Vandith, if I can turn it over to you from this and move from tools to nudges. You've written about behavioral nudges, and you know, can you explain your contention? How do we look at behavioral nudges in the context of responsible gaming?
Thanks, Vivan. It's nice to meet you all here. So some of my work has been in the domain of responsible gaming, in really understanding what kind of behavioral nudges can actually lead people from bad behavior to good behavior. There are multiple aspects to this. First, let's understand what a behavioral nudge is. It might just be a small notification which says, hey, you spent a lot of time here. Do you want to take a break? Now, this ties back into some of the points that Sarah was making before, and so to the points that Manjunath was also making before, which is these behaviors on how people react to these nudges gives a lot of information to us on what kind of users they are. Once we can identify these users early, it's always better for us to figure out the right path of redemption for them. I'm using redemption in a loose way here. All that I mean by redemption is if there are players playing responsibly, you want to positively encourage and give the right kind of reinforcement for their good behavior, right? Complying with the platform policies and complying with the game policies. At the same time, if somebody is going on a bad track, and if we can identify it early, again, some of the things that Manjunath was talking about also ties back to that. Every trial a user leaves is a behavioral prediction point for what they're likely to do going forward. It's all updated probabilities with every step that we see. With that, we'll be certain about what kind of actions they're likely to take. Once you know the kind of actions, go back, figure out what kind of interventions you want to give them. Sometimes, there might be a set of users for whom hard limits actually work. If you don't let them play after they cross the limit that they've set for themselves, it probably leads to better behavior. To actually give it some business context here, there is literature academically which shows that when you have regulations put in place for certain kind of users, it actually improves their customer lifetime value. This is counterintuitive to how a lot of companies think. They think that, hey, we regulate users, we are losing out money. But that's if you're playing the short-term game. In most cases, if you do the right kind of interventions and regulations early upon for the users, with the right kind of behavioral nudges, it leads to better customer lifetime value, because when you show care to the customer, they reciprocate and come back to you if you do it the right way. And again, this is where a lot of academic literature also has to come into play, because right now we do not have enough evidences to say what kind of practices work in what contexts, and what kind of practices actually lead to better behavior amongst users. So this is where we need to go as academicians as well. And I would also urge any of the
just to press you on that, how do you collect the data around this as an academic? What would you need from industry, many of whom are in the room?
So there are different ways to study these things. Let's start with the easiest way and the most viable way to implement, which is experimentation. Now, whenever you talk about RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, we actually have a control group who are not given an intervention. We have a treatment group who are given a particular intervention, and we try to see what is the impact of that intervention on this treated group. Now, because we have so many different types of interventions that we want to run, we need to have a large enough user base to run these interventions, and that might not be possible for all sorts of games. So it's okay to differentiate these interventions across different types of games and get those learnings and combine them and start preparing a policy draft or a policy recommendation, which can then let enforce a better responsible gaming policy.
Thank you. And in fact, I think on this legacy issue of skill versus chance, this is one of the ways in which regulators or standard setting organizations can proceed, whether industry-based or otherwise, to create a control group and measure
Absolutely.
from there and RCT equivalent methods.
Absolutely.
But Mr. Maheshwari, the policy question brings us to you. We've talked about now the kinds of tools that we're seeing across the world that are working or not working. Manjuji's mentioned how some of the tracking can be done by vendors like him to identify the good and the bad. There are behavioral nudges that Professor Vandith has spoken of. But somewhere we may also need to think about what the long tail of this sector looks like. There are a lot of large actors. There are also a lot of actors that are under the radar that constitute the long tail of this sector, that would like to stay, not above board. So how do we account for responsible behavior in those spaces? And what is the need for the state to try to level the playing field, so to speak?
Yeah. So first of all, sorry for being late. When the norms are not defined or norms are frequently changed, it always leads to chaos on the road today, but in the cyber world.
Are you talking about subordinate legislation in India?
Yes, on that front also. So the whole idea is that while the smaller players, particularly say, need to be promoted, the law on some principles must be the same for all the players. When it comes to sort of responsible gaming, certain aspects of maybe defining the age rating, particularly if it happens to be casual games, freewares, free games, freemium games, or in terms of maybe certain time limitations, or in terms of maybe certain financial limitations which must be put depending upon the behavior of the gamer. Today, when we are talking of the DPDP Act, we are also expecting that maybe every gaming operator, for that reason, barring the smaller ones, because smaller ones will once again be given certain exemptions, but otherwise, a normal gaming operator, the larger gaming operator, has to have clear policies in terms of what data they are collecting, why are they collecting, what for they are using this data, for how long they will be retaining it, with whom it is being transferred, and all those things, I mean, which most of you must be aware of, the DPDP Act and the rules which are likely to maybe come up shortly, at least the draft part of it. I mean, overall, if the norms are very clear, if how those norms are going to be followed is also very clear, maybe there is a certification process which is introduced. Maybe there are frequent or, in fact, regular audits which are done in a way that brings in semblance of whatever is being done. In fact, along with DPDP Act, it is security also which has been indirectly brought into the game, into the legal arena. So far it was like a business issue. It's no longer a business issue only, it's also a legal issue. And to that an extent, either on front of privacy or in terms of security or in terms of the best practices which are available, which most of the associations and federations have defined for their members. The whole idea is that if such rules of the game are clear, known, and smaller companies on certain accounts are exempted, maybe it is a sort of a level playing kind of a field in which everybody can survive. The bigger ones, I mean, the smaller ones can aspire to grow. Bigger ones can continue to maybe maintain their lead. And somebody, I mean, some players, some operators which are considered to be illegal are discouraged to the extent possible.
Thank you. Sarah, we'll dial it back to responsible gaming again with you, the construct that you have put in doubt. Look, Professor Vandith talked about the need for hard limits sometimes. And I was just wondering, again, if you have a global vantage point, you must know where hard limits are working and where they're not. And we read here about attempts, for instance, in China not succeeding vis-a-vis hard limits, and particularly minors finding their workarounds via various methods. So are there instances where hard limits do indeed work? If so, what are they? What are the instances where soft limits work? What are the limitations of soft limits? And is there a sort of differentiation between harms when you think of limits? So financial versus behavioral harms. How are countries juxtaposing these as they sort of think about limits? So sorry, it's a long question, but over to you. I think she's muted.
Hard limits. There are hard limits in place in, for example, Germany. And again, Germany has the same regulatory structure as India. You've got the states or the Länder, and then you've got the federal government, which regulates online. And it's really complicated. If anybody ever says to me, how do German gambling regulations work? I just say, please ask ChatGPT, because it's very complicated. So in Germany, there is a hard limit for everybody of €1,000 across the board if you're playing online casino. And what's happened is that the land-based casinos have not implemented those hard limits. So you can go into a bar in Berlin, you can sit there all evening in front of a huge video lottery terminal with 3 screens, with beer and your vape, chatting to your friends, and the machine is actually on autoplay, so you're sitting there and the machine is basically churning through your money all evening, and you can do that all evening, every evening if you like. So hard limits, particularly if they're applied across the board, just kind of squish down the opportunity and the demand, and that just sort of pops up somewhere else. In terms of soft limits, coming back to Professor's views on interventions, what we see an awful lot of the time is that a machine learning program will identify someone who is playing riskily, they'll pop up as flagged, and a recommendation is made to that player about, perhaps you should set a deposit limit, perhaps you should set a time limit. And these limits are definitely useful. They are absolutely useful. We can see that time and time again. A deposit limit is a great way for someone to stay in control. The difficulty we have, coming back to my first point, is that with responsible gaming messaging at the moment, people turn off because it's associated with gambling addiction. So time and again, I'll do research with players and say, what do you think about deposit limits and time limits? And are they a good thing? And they go, oh yeah, they're great. Yeah, we should definitely have those. But obviously I wouldn't use them because I don't have a problem. So yes, absolutely, we should have soft limits. But again, it's all about reducing stigma, encouraging the use of these tools, whether that's by saying, okay, the Canadians, for example, particularly in British Columbia, use this phrase of player health. Now, I don't know how that would translate into an Indian context. It works well in West Coast Canada, because that's the sort of place it is. Whether or not that would work as well in India, I don't know. So I think I've answered the hard limits, not a good idea generally. Soft limits work when you message them correctly and you can get people to take notice of an intervention. What was the third question? I think there was a third question.
The differentiation between harms, financial and behavioral, as you think of responsible gaming.
So financial harm is what we call the first level harm, because it drives other harms. So the thing that you are most likely to do if you are spending too much on your gaming is you are likely to be using money that you should use for something else. And so that spend then drives other issues, like you start lying to people, you can't, your mental health is affected. What we see generally is a kind of a vicious circle where a lot of people play because they're feeling down, they're feeling stressed, they're feeling anxious. So they play to kind of soothe those feelings. And what then happens when they lose money is that those feelings are exacerbated and they go into this spiral. So financial harm really is the driver of other harms in our view. It's the number one thing to try and be avoided, and that's why deposit limits, loss limits, and also what's really useful is a profit and loss account. Make sure you can see, if you are a player, you can see what you have lost recently or won.
Thank you. Professor Vandith, I'm breaking the order and coming to you. I think, again, to restate what Sarah is trying to say is we don't conflate gambling with gaming.
Absolutely.
We don't take a very paternal approach to these tools that turn people off, which means, therefore, that they should not be regulated into existence. And at the same time, there should be some sort of a common minimum that industry adheres to, as per what Mr. Maheshwari said. But other than these tools around limitations and a certain minimum cybersecurity, privacy, hygiene that you expect from services, what are the other kind of nudges that can be built to signal to the user what is responsible behavior?
That's interesting because there's so many little interventions that are driven by our social norms that actually make us nicer to people around us when we talk to them. How do we build responsibility when we talk to each other in a new crowd? We have some decorum that we learn. And that can come in education on one side. On the other side, think of interventions like what happens when you have a gym buddy, for example. When you have a gym buddy, you feel accountable for somebody else going to gym, and you turn up because you feel responsible for somebody else. The same can happen even in gaming. You can have accountability partners when you game. That suddenly changes your propensity to go into bad behaviors because you know somebody close to you will be monitoring you or will have the information about what you're doing. That suddenly changes how you behave. This by itself, in some controlled environments that we've tested regulated a lot of bad behaviors. Even language gets regulated if you know somebody close to you will have access to what you speak.
On that point, sometimes group dynamics can be much worse than individual dynamics too, right? So this is very interesting that in the case of play, they tend to better play rather than worse.
I'm actually not talking about better play. Probably I'm talking about responsible aspects of playing. For example, if I set a limit of 50,000 rupees per month for some game, from some real money gaming that I'm doing, and I cross that limit, the fact that my friend will know that I crossed the limit itself is a moderation factor for me not to cross that limit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Manju, all of this, there is also a premise that, and I don't know if we are all accepting this premise, but certainly seems to be one, that there's a lot of data collection going on behind the scenes. And it doesn't, in my mind, quite square off with how we think about data protection or privacy in terms of data minimization being a goal to aspire to at the very least. How does the need for more surveillance in a sense, whether it is other friends or the service itself or mandatory standards, square off with data minimization as a principle? And again, back to some of the examples that you stated about keystrokes, etc. How do you think about this as a company?
Well, collecting data, in the sense, it's a very thin line. You're looking at whether it's a bane or a bone. Also, you mentioned about DPDP Act. Again, it's important to understand the distinction between why this is in place, right? So what we're collecting data, or what the gaming companies are also collecting data, I think this distinction should be clearly laid out in terms of, if this data is to actually make the system and the platform and the ecosystem better, then it allows it, right? So here, the whole objective is to actually keep bad gamers out. But obviously, we're all well aware that the same data can actually be used for commercial gains, for marketing and other purposes. So which is where the responsibility is also, with the governing bodies to actually make it really clear, as well as the gaming companies in terms of how do they actually convey what kind of consent is required, and also the end users to be actually aware of that, right? So what we do as an organization is, as I mentioned, we also collect a lot of information, but this is at a macro level to be able to provide insights in terms of if that particular person's a good user or not. Let me just give you another example. Again, big data, ML, AI, all of this is actually used to be able to differentiate between, for example, I'll give you something that you all can relate to is in terms of bots. The way bots behave versus what individuals and humans behave is completely different. Right? So this is where you can actually use it for your, for the advantage of the ecosystem to be able to differentiate and then say that we can collect macro level information to be able to keep these antisocial elements away from games.
So, Mr. Maheshwari, this is an interesting thread which I want you to pick up on. We've talked about good and bad and ugly for the last 2 days again. And here too, I think we're alluding to some good data set, bad data set type of issue, where, as he said, there should be a legitimate purpose in a sense, and if that exists, then behavioral monitoring, so to speak, should be allowed. But this is again not the way in which I think we're looking at data protection today. So will you touch on some of these horizontal issues and also, other related issues of child protection and the way we're thinking about vulnerable communities when we regulate? How would you proceed from this discussion onwards to frame such interventions?
Yeah. So first, let's understand, as to what is the requirement as mandated in the DPDP Act. And particularly when any data fiduciary is dealing with child-related data, the consent has to come from parent or the legal guardian. So it's child and the parent put together becomes the data principle in the context of DPDP Act. The Act further mandates that nothing shall be done, particularly in the context of child, which is detrimental to, so per se, harms have not been defined, but it has been conveyed in spirit that nothing detrimental shall be done, or nothing shall be done which is likely to be detrimental to the maybe health or maybe psychological impact on the child. The third thing, and which is very important, is that no tracking or behavioral monitoring shall be done. Now this is where the conflict, particularly what you are talking about, so maybe you are talking in terms of monitoring, tracking in order to, let's say, to ensure the rightful behavior. But what is rightful behavior or why it is being monitored or tracked, as of today in the DPDP Act, it is prohibited. However, an exception clause has also been conveyed that subject to certain terms and conditions, and if the platform can show certain verifiable safety measures, that the age can be lowered or maybe can be completely waived off. So there are certain test cases like hospitals, educational institutions, where definitely there is a need. There is, a clearly understood exception which is carved out, but in all other cases, either you have to ensure that the rules do provide some sort of a leeway, or you clearly prove that whatever is being done is quite safe, and that safety has to be demonstrated. Safe practices have to be demonstrated as have been stated and as are being permitted through the rules which are likely to come up, as I mentioned, soon. So definitely it's going to be a challenge, particularly for the online gaming industry, where you are targeting audience less than 18.
And just on that, a lot of the audience, which is, young adults, let's say, whether they're below 18 or above, there is also this large phenomenon, and Sarah, I also want you to come in on this, so we'll make it a quick intervention, sir, are playing casual games where there is a financial component, and as Sarah said, financial harm is kind of the gateway drug, so to speak, for behavioral problems. So your thoughts on how do we begin to identify such bad behavior, in terms of the industry offerings out there? Are we even thinking about some of these gray areas in a sense?
I may not be, I don't know whether I will be able to directly answer, but then I know when we were part of, at least I was part of the ministry, there were lots of complaints which we were receiving because of time-wise addiction of children on certain games. And when we interacted with that particular platform, we were told that you can play continuously for 12 hours or even more. Now that is something which is definitely going to cause harm. At least that's our belief, that's my belief was. And that's where we wanted, maybe of course you must have already taken the age. So age versus times establish some sort of a correlation, but beyond that, at least start giving warnings, and somewhere there should be a dead end. In terms of finance and financial practices also, so while they may be called as free games, one, there can always be a subscription, and then there can be always certain microtransactions which may be happening in app purchases, which may be happening. So now here also, I completely agree that behavior is important to be able to understand and set the limits in a dynamic manner, but how exactly it shall be done and it will be permitted, at least I am, as of today, not very clear as to how the law will allow all these kind of things.
Also, sir, it's not very clear, your social media usage, for instance, is through the roof. And what people are spending time on also changes every 5 years. Perhaps, nobody knew of these video apps 5 or 6 years ago, and now they seem to be consuming a lot of time. So, Sarah, just to pick up that thread on casual games, the kind of sort of financial transactions that we're increasingly seeing in some of these games, these will also take different forms over time. So there was a time when crypto was, big in gaming. I don't know if it still is. There are loot boxes and there are issues around that in Europe. How do you look at some of these issues through the lens of your institute?
So we're very concerned, actually. We think that a lot of regulators and governments are just not aware of this. As we've said, as the panel has all said, this technology changes really, really quickly. And it's almost always, unfortunately, the regulators who are running to try and catch up. The technology providers are always ahead of the game. So I think what would be useful is if we as an industry think about what should we be doing that's the right thing. And certainly what we see with things like social casino, which is big on app stores and Play Store, where you play something that looks like a slot game, you play with these kind of doodly bloops that don't have any value, and you run out of doodly bloops, so you pay real money to buy some more doodly bloops, and of course you can't then cash that out. That, at the moment, from a regulatory perspective, is not seen as gambling because it's not a real money interaction. So we're, certainly in Europe and in the States, we're working hard to try and address this and to try and make sure that social casino, that loot boxes are regulated more strongly, because we absolutely see a link between pre-teens, teens playing social casino and then moving into real casino and getting into trouble because they simply don't understand the risks. So I'm really glad you brought this up. Thank you. It is definitely an issue.
Thank you. And I'd encourage a couple of questions from the audience here. And just while people are thinking of this question, because Sarah mentioned this, look, in the West and with AAA rated games, video games in general, we've seen ratings play a big role in informing users about safety and other aspects, content related mostly. But do you envision a future where it's possible perhaps to use some of these ratings as tools for self-regulation rather than chase the technology? It's become almost axiomatic. In every forum we will discuss that regulators are going to be behind technology. So is it time now to think about alternative measures in this area?
I'm assuming it's for me.
Yeah. And we'll take 2 questions right after this, so a short answer.
This, the idea of rating is very interesting because it also depends on who is the rating authority is. For example, if you think of, say, Android App Store or iOS rating their apps on one other additional parameter called safety or responsible, however you want to put it. It informs parents, moderating them from bad behavior, and make sure the parents are going to regulate their children accordingly, right? They will not install apps that do not have this rating. At the same time, app stores can actively recommend these safer apps which have the right set of practices. So that's one place where ratings come into picture. Also, if you think of the ecosystem, once we have a critical mass of apps being rated safe, it becomes a competitive thing. And the rest of the good players in the market would want to come on board with these safe practices and get those ratings. So it also creates a healthy environment and weed out bad players or bad companies that do not want to comply with these practices out of the ecosystem. And these ratings can be either places like app stores or external agencies which can set up store and say, we'll as third-party raters give certain rating to apps.
So an idea for some of the young entrepreneurs in this audience. We have a couple of questions. We can please direct your questions at the relevant panelist. Please make sure they're actually questions, of course. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Vikram. My question is to the professor. You talk something very interesting about collecting data about user behavior, especially with respect to children. One of my concerns is that while you do collect that data actively, do you really believe that children would be that articulative in terms of letting you know their responses towards these games? And secondly, in a country like India, how much are we confident about parents' response of a child's engagement for a certain game?
Okay, thank you.
It's for me. I'm assuming.
Yes, Vandith.
Yes,
So there's when it comes to an underage or minor gaming, I think it's a different ball game altogether. And of course, it should be more parental controls, more information to the parents that will drive this. It's not going to be behavioral nudges on the kids directly itself. Is that where you're going with your question?
Yeah, I'm going there as well. But you see, parents' control have been introduced in the past, and we have seen that they are not really working the way they should have been working. There are parent controls in OTT, there are parent controls in TV viewing, but I think kids are more upfront in terms of using parent controls rather than parents using them. So considering that, but the risk which is involved in case of OTT or broadcast media is not as much as it would be in case of gaming, especially the RMD gaming. So as a parent, the biggest concern would be how would a parent know that the kid is actually getting into RMB space while it's not the age for them to go into?
You have that. You have a
that's
nutcracker, because it's a tough nut to crack.
Absolutely, and that's not something that's easy to. There's no one right answer for this as well. It's not something that's easy to crack, like he's saying. What I could say is, each time there is in-app behavior or in-game behavior that is measured, and rather than saying parental controls of setting time limits or only allow certain content, which is the common thing that we see, information going back to parents about how the children are spending time within an app becomes more important. Parental controls in observing, hey, they've spent so much time talking to 7 set of different people from 3 different continents, and here were 3 abusive words in their conversations, if there were chats, is something that the parents could have the right to know.
Also, parents have a mentor role, right? I mean, if parents themselves are on social media all day, then it's rich to say that your children should limit their use.
That's a different rabbit hole to get into. I agree.
I find this to be the case a lot of the time. Last question. We have satiated the audience, or there's one more? Yeah.
So, not to any specific panel member. So, in terms of, I think we've had multiple discussions over the last day or different aspects about the externalities arising out of gaming, right? I think we did have a little bit of a focus on the negative externalities today around gambling, etc. But there are a lot of research around positive externalities, right?
Your question?
The question is basically around, we have formal bodies in, say, finance, wealth, and so on and so forth, which are regulated properly because we see a lot of positive externality. Given that there is almost similar positive externality in gaming, how do we take a similar approach through mechanisms so that even the gaming industry sees benefit out of it and not just...
I think Mr. Maheshwari, quick response to that. Anyone else who wants to also 30-second response? Also, I think I would add a layer. The government is collecting enough taxes now for this to be worth regulating. You could ask this question a year ago and it may not have resulted in a definitive answer, but over to you.
Definitely the cyber norms or norms for online gaming also need to be there. Presently, while an attempt was made, the rules were published. Maybe because they have not been implemented, the scenario continues to be as confusing as it was. In fact, maybe more confusing today because there is no direction while the rules are there. So I do believe not only for RMG, but also particularly for maybe having some sort of a responsible behavior in terms of operators developing games for children, including, and then, from the government side, clearly having an age rating criteria or whatever safety features they think should be there and how exactly should it be implemented. Time and again, it has been conveyed, yes, for the emerging technologies, the lesser the role of the government is, the better it is. So, I mean, on these few premises, maybe things have to be taken forward, and that's it.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Time's up, behavioral nudge. Thank you.